time.
I'm president of an organisation called Equilibrium Future Solutions. We're basically a welfare/environmental organisation, and although we do environmental activism, these two guys are here with us as well. We also run social programs doing environmental restoration work as well. So that's our main thing. And then as a side thing, we also do activism work and protesting as well. What I want to talk to you about today is salt, the problem with salt with coal seam gas mining. But in order for you to understand it, I've got to give you a very quick lesson on landscape hydrology. Now keep in mind this is an entire uni degree that I'm going to stick to you in about 5 minutes, so I'll see how good I can get it, but I believe I'll get you to understand the basics. And once you understand the basics, then I'll give you statistics, because the statistics mean nothing unless you understand what's going on under the ground. It's actually my own diagram that I drew up. If you're wondering where I got this information from, it isn't out of a textbook, you won't find it anywhere. It's through working with a guy called Peter Andrews, and Peter Andrews is currently doing river restoration all over the country. And I've worked with him where we've turned salt deserts into arable land, which is land you can grow food on, within about 6 months. And that was previously thought impossible, so I'm using that knowledge to show you what's going on under the ground and how the hydrology of the landscape works. So this is basically a top view looking down on a floodplain. The reason I'm using a floodplain is because it's the most level land, and that's the land I'll pick for coal seam gas mining. The leveler it is, the easier it is to set up infrastructure. So this edge here, I think the thing's not working very well. Oh, there you go. That edge is just the edge of the floodplain. That's the edge of the floodplain. The floodplain is that centre bit there, and these sections are the hills. It may not make sense now, but as I talk it will. These are the choke points in the floodplain. So these are where the hills come in and create thin points in the floodplain. So this is a section of a long floodplain that I've just gone to 2 choke points. So this is a section between 2 choke points. Where the choke points form, one thing you've got to understand is that a lot of people think that the floodplain existed and then the river just turned up. The truth is that the river built the floodplain. So in order to picture how the system works, you've got to start with how the floodplain actually was developed. So at these choke points, when I get a major flood, the sort of floods we've seen up at Queensland lately, you get the whole floodplain, not just the river, you get the whole floodplain under flow. When that happens, at the wide point in the floodplain, water moves quite quickly. Then as it hits the choke point, the water slows down and backs up on itself, sediment drops out of suspension, and we end up building a sandbar at each point on the choke point. Behind those sandbars, you get ponds forming. And then as the ponds break over the sandbar, you get deltas forming, and then the deltas merge back to a main rifle or stream, back to a pond at the next step, back to a set of trees that goes down the floodplain. Remember, the floodplain may have many choke points all the way down it. Okay, the reason you need to understand that is because it's actually flood events that build the floodplain up and build these sections here. Okay. I'll go to the next picture because that's a whole lesson in itself. I just wanted you to get a rough idea of how, well, before you do. Here's the main flow, here's the secondary flow lines, and there's the billabongs. Now the billabongs always come off the secondary flow lines. These main ponds are part of the primary flow line. Okay? And one other thing before you change it, the river actually runs down the high point in the floodplain. Because everyone has this concept that water flows to the low points. Because the river actually built the floodplain, the river actually sits on the high point in the floodplain. Go to the next one. The next one is a cross-section of what you've just been looking at. And you can see the river is actually at the high point on the floodplain. There's the secondary flow lines, and there's the wetlands between. Okay? What happens this is what we call an influence system. An influence system is where the river fills the floodplain. Because my river sits at the high point, when it fills up with water, the water moves into this sandy section below it. The reason that there's a sandy channel below the river is because as the river is building the floodplain, in normal flow, heavy particles, which are sandy particles, fall out of suspension first. So it's actually the sandy particles that build up the riverbanks, and because the river built the whole floodplain, you end up with a sandy channel beneath the river and beneath the secondary flow lines. So all rivers and all secondary flow lines have a sandy channel beneath them that goes all the way to the bottom of the floodplain. Okay, when the system is functioning properly, the rivers are full of water, the water then infiltrates into these sandy channels, and then the water pressure then pushes out of these sandy channels and fills the clay and the clay sediments in between the sandy channels. So these are silt and clay, and they're the sandy channels. So the river fills easily up these sandy channels, then the water pressure pushes out into the surrounding floodplain. And basically we end up with a floodplain full of water. Any water that falls on the hills, remember this is a natural floodplain, so I still have a lot of vegetation on the slopes. Whenever I have forest or vegetation, those roots crack the soil open, vegetation slows the flow of water down, so most of the water doesn't run off the surface, it actually seeps into the ground and enters the floodplain through the ground table. So nearly all water entering the floodplain fills the ground table right to the very top. That's a natural system, and that's how all our floodplains used to be. If you look at the arrows are actually indicating the currents under the ground. So here obviously currents go downhill, and then the currents from here move, and these are the two lowest points in the floodplain. The edge of the floodplain is always the lowest points because the river builds up from the centre and deposits sediment out from that. So you always have wetland low points, and that is where the salts deposit. So if you're thinking salts dissolve in water, they're only going to move wherever the water currents take them, and all water currents lead to those low points. In a natural system, they are salt processing wetlands. So salts never build up in a system, they constantly push the edge of the floodplain. Keep in mind as well, salts tend to be excessive plant nutrients, that's all they are. So if they're pushed to the edge of the floodplain, these plants are specially designed to take up huge amounts of nutrients and process them. All they do is turn them into plant parts, plant body parts. The animals then come and eat them, and they're spread through the food chain, and that's how they're released from the system. Any excess during large flood events are then washed out into the ocean. So pretty much the system cleans itself all the time. Okay, this is a degraded floodplain. This is how our floodplains look now. Okay, basically we cleared the vegetation off all the hills. As soon as I clear the vegetation off the hills, the water now predominantly flows across the landscape. It does not enter through the ground anymore. And as I get water flowing down the floodplain, it now runs quicker and faster and begins to dig down deep eroded channels. What you end up with is a central channel running through the centre of the... They can crisscross across the floodplain, but all these primary flow lines, all these secondary flow lines, all the billabongs and wetlands have now all dried up because that river now sits in a deep channel. The water now drains out of the ground, and we now drain the landscape. Can we have a look at the next one? The next one is a cross-section of this. There's the cross-section. We've now removed the vegetation. Water now flows down the slope, removing soil as it goes. So I've now got soil being removed off my hills. Because the water now flows off the hills, where those low points used to be, which used to be the wetland, the salt-producing area, that now becomes a channel. And a channel, as the water flows down, it flows through those channels straight to the ocean. These side channels tend to erode first because water flows off the hills. As those side channels begin to erode, the water table drops because the water is now draining into those side channels. But inevitably over time, the central channel tends to become the deepest of all, and the minute that central channel becomes the deepest, all groundwater flows now head to the new lowest point in the floodplain. Remember, it used to be the side channels, nicely where the salt-producing wetland plants used to be. Now, the lowest point is the river, so of course our river becomes salty, which is what's happening all over the country right now. The Murray at the point down in southern Australia, it's almost as salty as the ocean by the time it gets down there. That's how salty the oceans are. And virtually all of our river systems, streams and major tributaries have become fairly salty just through this new hydrology of the landscape. We've basically turned what was an influent system into an effluent system. So before, the river used to sit up here, it would be full of water, the water would then drain in and fill the landscape up. Now the river's in a deep channel. If the landscape fills up, it just simply drains back out into that channel, so whatever depth the channel is the new depth of the ground table. Does that make sense? And in some areas the ground table has dropped anywhere up to 40 or 50 feet. That is massive. Okay? The minute that happens, how can the plants possibly get their roots down to the water anymore? They can't, so the surface turns into a desert. Okay? I'm just going to add something to that. We've not only created a desert, because the hydrology of the landscape, which used to process the salts, push them out to the edge to be processed by plants, that all doesn't exist anymore. The salts now end up in the river, and what does the farmer do? The farmer irrigates out of the river, back onto the landscape. Now the salts build up in our topsoils. Okay? We've now turned what was a perfectly pristine environment into a salt desert. And it has absolutely nothing to do with carbon dioxide or any of those things. It's all to do with just removing the vegetation. Okay? And can I just say, this isn't about climate change, but carbon dioxide is a minor component of climate change. Climate change is virtually all to do with devegetation. Okay? Doesn't mean we want coal seam gas. Yeah. And that process, if you want to just understand that quickly, can you go back to? Because I think this is an important point as well. It'll just take me 2 more minutes. Back one, yeah, that's it. See how the water is right in the top of the floodplain? The plant's roots go down into the water, the sun shines on the plants, the water's sucked out of the plants, I create clouds, I create humidity. The low pressure systems over the ocean can now be drawn inland because I now have humidity over the land, and the low pressures come in and rain. The minute I remove the vegetation, go forward, there's now no water, there's no way possible the sun can shine on the ground here, but it ain't going to suck any water up. I now have dry air above the landscape, the low pressure systems over the ocean will no longer move inland, and I've now dried the entire continent out. Absolutely nothing to do with carbon dioxide, I've got to tell you. Okay? Also, don't forget, plants insulate the landscape. So once I remove the plants, the soil now heats up. It heats the air above it, we now heat the planet up. If you're in a hot climate and I remove the insulation layer, it gets hotter. If I'm in a cold climate and I remove the insulation layer, it gets colder. That's why when we talk about climate change, some parts of the world are going to go freezing, some parts of the world are going to go hot. Nothing is, even though overall the planet may be heating up slightly, the fact is that we're just creating extremes of hot and cold. That is what's happening on the planet right now. Once I create extremes of hot temperatures and cold temperatures, the gradient between those air masses, the heat gradient is massive, so I now increase the wind velocity. I now increase the ability for storms to become more voracious. I'll just add one thing in there. Carbon dioxide and other pollutants we put into the atmosphere does thicken the atmosphere. Now, if I thicken a gas without expanding its volume, I increase its potential energy or its kinetic energy. So that would then influence the ferocity of storms as well. But predominantly the reason most of the world is drying out and becoming a desert is all to do with devegetation. Okay, can we go to the next? Here's the salts. The salts deposit in the river, but don't forget salt water is heavier than fresh, so inevitably most of the salt water settles deep down in the floodplain out of harm's way. Okay, can we go on? Remember, can I just say that most of that salt is actually from farmers over-fertilising with chemical fertilisers. Because that salt is predominantly just excessive plant nutrients. Okay, now I've added to this, I've now put in the coal seam gas pipes, and I've put in the underlying rock strata. The brown represents the impermeable rock, or rock that water can't move through. The blue in between is the aquifers, which can either be like a sandstone or a gravel or some type of permeable rock that water can move through. And then you've got another layer of impermeable, another aquifer, and then this is just an idea. It could be many layers before you hit the coal, but for me I'm going for 4 layers. There's a coal seam, back to the aquifer, back to the impermeable, and back to another coal seam. There's a coal seam there. Okay? What we've got is this water here in the floodplain. That's basically your ground table. From the previous diagram I showed you, you now know that is full of salt. So that is basically salt water held within the ground table. If you were to put something down to pump the water out, it's basically bore water, the sort of water you couldn't drink. It's just salty and disgusting, okay? That is what sits in there. The water that sits in the actual aquifers themselves, that is pure fresh water. That is filtered pure fresh water. As well, the water that sits in the coal mine, because actually within the coal seam itself is water trapped in there as well, and that also is perfectly clear filtered water. The coal almost acts like a carbon filter and filters the water. So everything under the floodplain is perfect crystal clear water. Everything above the floodplain is salt, pretty much, and up to 10,000 milligrams per litre, which is about 1/3 as salty as the ocean. It gets pretty salty down there. Can we go to the next one? Okay, what we've done is I've just shown that this is the coal seam. They've now pumped huge volumes of water mixed with huge volumes of sand, as well as with a whole range of chemicals, up to hundreds of different kinds of chemicals. And might I just say, the reason I don't talk too much about the chemicals is because most of the chemicals are actually a secret. They won't even tell us. So it's a little bit like McDonald's secret sauce that they put on their hamburgers. It's an industry secret. Well, the coal seam gas guys are telling us the same thing. So it's an industry secret not to know the chemicals. So even the Australian government does not know what chemicals they're using. And for most of the chemicals they're using, there's no material safety data sheets. There's no evidence of anything to do with those chemicals being used. So we have no idea what's going on. And neither do the coal seam miners, I tell you. Okay, once we've cracked open the coal seam, once we've cracked it open, we now release that gas that was actually trapped within the coal seam. Once it's broken, the gas can escape. And now through these pipes, we can suck the gas back up. The only problem is that as soon as we crack the coal seam, all this water from the aquifer drains in. So that in order to get the gas out, I've also got to pump that water out as well. So I end up with a huge amount of water, but I need to separate the gas and the water. Okay, the next one. At this point, the water would be pretty clean. So the water they're pumping out might be the same as drinking water, as salt levels. Next one. Oh, this is it. Okay, what happens is as they're pumping the water out, the water pressure in these aquifers drop because they're draining down into here and then they're pumping it up and then they're trying to get rid of it. As soon as the water in this aquifer drops, that allows this salty water from the landscape to start seeping in, because this pressure was what's stopping the salt coming in. They've now reduced the pressure, the salt water can start infiltrating into our perfect crystal clear aquifers. Next one. Okay, if I keep sucking the water out, I lose all of the fresh water in there, simply fills up with salt, and eventually the salt seeps down through these cracks and fills up even the aquifers below. So now pretty much what was our crystal clear, beautiful water is now pretty much the same salty water that exists in the bottom of the floodplain. Okay? What you've got to remember, these are rock strata, so if I was to bring this out, this aquifer may flow through the landscape and enter here. It may exit the ground in a hanging swamp, it may exit the ground in a wetland, it may exit the ground in a spring. But either way, I've got very salty water now exiting the ground. And that water could exit the ground hundreds of kilometres or tens of kilometres away from where the actual coal seam gas miners are. So there's many times where the coal seam gas miners are causing this, but that water seeps out the ground 100 kilometres over there, so nobody blames the coal seam gas miners. They have no idea. Nobody knows. That system under the ground is so complex, and all of these aquifers are joined and linked, that you just have no idea where this water is going to end up. Okay? So keep in mind, as long as they're pumping the gas out, they're also pumping out this salt water, and they now have to deal with the salt water. What do you do with it? What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a heap of statistics now. I just needed you to understand the rough concept of landscape hydrology. I'm going to give you statistics now on how much water and how much salt they're going to be bringing out. Can I just mention one thing? These statistics only relate to what they're pumping out. None of the statistics relate to what this water is doing once it exits the ground. Okay, they've not even considered that. And I'm talking that entire floodplain could drain, and it's going to end up somewhere. I don't know where it's going to end up, but it's going to end up destroying entire landscapes without a doubt. The sort of salt concentration we're talking about is a total biocide, so it doesn't matter what other chemicals are in with the salt, it's at a concentration that will kill all life, and it doesn't matter. Okay? Can we go to the next one? Okay, this is basically the Queensland Government's own website. It's the Department of Environment and Resource Management webpage. And this is just sort of stating what sort of situation they're finding with the water in regards to salt. You can also look up chemicals, but I'm just focusing on salt today. Okay, what they're discovering is that when they draw the water out of these coal seams, they test it for salt. It's ranging between 200 and 10,000 milligrams per litre. To give an idea of that, good fresh drinking water should be less than 500 milligrams per litre. So some of the water they're taking out of the coal seam gas mine is better than drinking water. Okay? That's the stuff where the salt hasn't yet infiltrated. As they produce the coal seam gas, the water gets anywhere up to 10,000 milligrams per litre, which is a third as salty as the ocean. That's after the ground table is leaked into the aquifer, and that's when they start getting these high results. Okay? One of the problems is that they're saying that there's all this salt, but there is no actual management for the salt. And even the Australian government has not put in any legislation or any rules that enforce the coal seam gas miners to process or deal with this salt. So basically we're giving them the right to go and mine the land, produce huge amounts of salt, destroy the landscape, and they don't even have to have a way or a method of dealing with this salt that they're producing. They basically just dump it. And at the moment they're dumping it directly into the headwaters of the Darling River up in Queensland. And that's EPA approved, I might add. Okay, so the government is approving all this, that's the problem. Okay, can we go to the next one? So that's just an example of what they're finding in the water. Okay, the next one, I did a bit of research and I found the ABC had done an investigative report themselves. And there's actually Coal Seam Gas by the Numbers, which is a web page they put out. I recommend you go on and have a bit of a look. This is just their estimate, or them working out how much salt is exactly going to be produced. And to make it easy to understand, each one of them represents the Melbourne cricket ground full of salt, just so we get an idea of how much we're talking about. Okay, 31 million tonnes sounds a lot, but as soon as you see it, it fills 15 Melbourne cricket grounds full to the top. That's how much salt. And can I just say before we go on, that is a very low estimate of how much water they're going to use. That's 300 gigalitres per year. Okay, but we'll just work off this because I'll talk about the other ones in a minute. At 300 gigalitres per year, they're going to have 31 million tonnes of salt that at this point, there is no idea what to do with. And the government is not even forcing them to come up with an idea of what to do with it. So it's just going to get dumped in our rivers and on our landscape. And that is what's happening right now. Okay? That is done by the Waste Commission, the National Waste Commission, and that is their reasonable estimate. Can we just go down? The full story on coal seam gas water use, keep going down. Here is the estimates from the rest of the place. Federal Government's Water Group estimates it at 5,400 gigalitres. Okay, if 300 gigalitres was 15 Melbourne cricket grounds, how much is 5,400 gigalitres? Is that up near the 140 Melbourne cricket grounds? Something like that. And that is an Australian Government water group that has come up with that number. Okay, so we've got to assume, and I still think they would be reasonable about it as well. They wouldn't be putting out the most extreme. So I would tell you that it's probably going to be more than 5,400 gigalitres of water. And that's per year, by the way, not over the whole life of coal seam gas mining. That is chemical laden. So all the chemicals they're putting down, when they suck that water up, not only does the salt water come up, all of those chemicals come up as well. So now we've got 5,500 gigalitres of salty, chemical laden water to now dispose of. What do we do with it? The Queensland Government themselves are saying 281, and the National Water Commission are saying 300. That's what that graph was worked off. But I can almost guarantee you that the water group themselves are still probably below the true mark. So, and if you have a look at the actual Santos and Origin Energy, they're saying 61, so they're miles off the mark. So can I just say, as a guesstimate, I'd be looking at between 5 and about 8,000 gigalitres a year. Now, if that makes no sense to you, how much water is that? Just go, Australia's entire household use is 1,800 gigalitres a year. So we're talking about an industry that could possibly use up to 4 or 5 times more water than the entire household use of Australia every single year. And then that water needs to be disposed of. But how do you dispose of toxic salty water? You can put it through reverse osmosis, you can pull all the salt out of it. Now you've got less salty and less toxic water, but now you've got a pile of toxic salt. So what do you do with that? Even when they put it in the evaporation basins, so they've got evaporation dams, they evaporate the water. Some of the toxic chemicals are now in the air for us to breathe, but a lot of them don't evaporate, they just adhere to the salt. So now I've got miles and miles and tons of highly toxic salt. What do you do with it? One of the recommendations I've heard is they can truck it to the ocean. Well, if it was clean salt, that may be viable, but you're talking about incredibly toxic salt that they want to truck and stick in the ocean. Because there's nothing, they really have no idea what to do with this. And the problem being that, without any idea on what to do with it, in fact this, to me, will destroy the country. Because not only have I now got millions of tonnes of salt to deal with, that's not including the flood train draining salt into the landscape. That doesn't include any of this salt. So we're talking just the most incredible amount of destruction that you could possibly imagine. And I am just referring to salt. I'm not even talking about the chemicals. Because as far as I can see, the salt is so destructive that the chemicals within the salt isn't going to make that much difference. Okay? And by cleaning the salt out of the water, you still end up with the salt, so it doesn't help you whatsoever. So in the end, we're talking about an industry that has been given approval by our government, they've been given permits by the EPA to basically come in and turn this country into a salt desert. And I absolutely guarantee, and I have a lot of experience working in salt deserts, I have a lot of experience of transforming salt deserts, but I also know how salt deserts form, because you have to understand how they form in order to know how to fix them. And I can tell you, this is going to be the nail in the coffin of this country. If you have any idea of what's happening already, probably about half of the existing deserts in this country are man-made salt deserts. Okay? A lot of people believe that this was the Great Brown Land, and it always has been. In fact, when the early explorers set out to western New South Wales, they were as far west as Broken Hill and describing it as the most fertile country in the world. That's because the Darling River used to run right through the west of New South Wales and hydrate the entire landscape. So what we now see as deserts was wetlands and forests and woodlands. It was just unbelievable. But the minute we cleared the trees, we changed the hydrology of the landscape, the salt built up, and we turned the whole thing to a desert. Does that make sense? Okay. So considering we've turned half the country into a salt desert already, and I mean farmers are walking off the land committing suicide, that's how bad the situation is. This last little bit is going to be more salt than we've produced since we've been here. and we're going to get more salt mobile than all the years we've already been here. So basically, whatever, and remember these guys are targeting even our most prime agricultural land. There is no land that they are saying they cannot access. And the Farmers Association just called for the community to act on their behalf, because basically the farmers spent 3 years talking with the government over this coal seam gas, or basically mining in general, and what farmers' rights do they have if miners want to come onto their land. So the farmers put all these things they wanted the government to consider. The government just put out their new Land Use Policy Act or whatever it is, and it actually negated every single right the farmer put in there. So basically the farmers, including us, but I talk about farmers because that is the main targeted land, but they can come right in here into town. At the moment they're sending a drill down in the actual green zone around Warragamba Dam, and that's the aquifers that fill the dam. So they're now going to pollute the water of a city of millions of people, and you aren't even allowed to take a dog into that green zone in case it does a shit. Yet they're allowed to drill down and pollute the entire ground table, which will seep into the dam. Okay, so these guys have no restrictions by government. There is no law in Australia that can stop them, because the Mining Act actually overrides every other land act in Australia. So that no matter whether it's a state forest, a national park, private land, it makes no difference. The government cannot stop them. Okay? And the reason the Mining Act was put in years and years ago is because mining or raw resources were basically the backbone of Australia, farming and mining. So this Mining Act was put in to ensure that we would always have a strong mining industry. The problem is it overrides everybody else's rights, and now the mining industry just controls everything. And we really, and they can't do anything about it. That is the norm of people in the community. The fact is that if we don't, our kids are stuffed. Our kids' are stuffed. There is no future in this country at all, because once the water is disturbed, the country turns to a salt desert. There is now no food. Okay? And that is what we're talking about in the future, a major food crisis and water crisis that will simply be disastrous, over and beyond any economic crisis we can have if we don't do this coal seam gas mining. Okay? So it's about time we weigh up economics over actual sustainability, and in this situation economics is put absolutely 100% before not only our sustainability of the environment but our human rights as well. So really, please stand up and make a noise about this. Thank you.
Ian Sutton, ladies and gentlemen.
Paul, I'm just going to say something quickly. Guys, the main reason why we're all here today would be, to come down to a basic principle, is the democracy principle. And democracy means all of us in our own little networks have the ability to make a difference by telling people the actual facts. The actual facts have to go. This is an amazing bunch of information. This man is so passionate, he's not in it for the money. He's in it for the love of the land and love of the people and love of the country and love of the world. We have got to stop disturbing the planet.
Our land, our